Hello, and welcome back to Varn Vlog's Radical Engagement Series. And today, I'm tackling what will likely be a pretty long series because I'm tackling a long analysis of On Authority by Engels from a anarchist adjacent perspective or an anarchist perspective um, that was published actually relatively recently on JudgeSabo's Substack, also available on the Anarchist Library. Now, it's a long series and I want to go into it, but I want to talk about why I'm going into these kind of debates recently. One, I get tired of the efficiency versus inefficiency, decentralization versus centralization debates that often plagued anarchists. I get tired of the historical point scoring that often plagues anarchists and Marxists too. But I've realized that I've often only understood the Marxist side and not dealt with some of the flaws of Marx and Engels' argumentation styles are their presentations of historical events, which are usually more complicated than either side is usually willing to admit. Now, in some ways, this is a way to get radicals in general past their own bullshit. And so that's what we're aiming to do in this engagement series. I find On Authority to be a particularly weak text by Engels, and I find that some of Engels' own work is not comportable with what he says in that text. But it's a classic text for a variety of reasons. Now, I'm going to read this from the Anarchist Library version, and I will link that version in the show notes. JudgeSabo is also, for full disclosure, he they, I don't know Judge Sabo's gender, are part of my Discord community, and which is mostly Marxist, but all kinds of radicals are in there, and that is why I was informed of this text. I was already getting annoyed with Engels' On Authority and its recent popularity because it's just such a problematic text. And I'm generally an Engels defender, as I've said before. But when Marx and Engels say something that I disagree with or I think is wrong, I'm not going to ignore it just because of who said it. All right, so let's get into this discussion by JudgeSabo. Read On Authority How Engels Mocked the Whole World. Now, already, I think that's a huge framework, but nonetheless. On Authority 150 years later. Engels' On Authority was originally published in December 1873, not 1973. Ooh, that's a mistake. 1873. And even 150 years later, it's frequently presented by Marxists as the definitive refutation of anarchism. Varn's already going to say. It's specifically generally presented as the Marxist-Leninist refutation of anarchism. Some other anarchists will present it, but I like I said, I remember it being considered an embarrassment back in the day. Anyway, it's not hard to see why this essay is popular. I'm not sure that it is popular outside of Marxist-Leninist circles. We never read it when I was coming up in Marxist world. Its popularity, to me, I actually knew from anarchists arguing with it, and I often, on one of the rare occasions that I did, sided with the anarchist. So we'll get into that in a few as we read this. But I think my first actual encounter with On Authority was actually in the anarchist FAQ. Oh, probably in the mid to late aughts. So that is where I first encountered it as a graduate student in Georgia. All right. Anyway, it is exceptionally short, being only 4 pages long, and is not overly technical and full of pithy, biting, and easily quotable remarks. It is also, ironically, carries a fair amount of authoritative weight itself, being written by Marx's closest ally, and remains one of the main theoretical sources for rebuking anarchism elsewhere, such as Vladimir Lenin's State and Revolution. We'll get to that eventually. In many ways, it sets a sort of basic framework for how Marxists respond to anarchist theory, which I find embarrassing, personally. I find it embarrassing for both sides, actually. For some, on authority is also seen as useful for its duplicitous reasons. As anarchists or anti-authoritarians, all non-anarchist positions are referred to as authoritarian. Engels is very explicitly in defending authoritarianism, but in a way that should not be confused with the more common modern usage. In Engels' framework, even the most democratic government is authoritarian, in contrast to the more narrow meaning today to refer especially to anti-democratic and anti-imperialistic states like autocracies and military juntas. Given that many self-described Marxist states have been described as authoritarian in the latter sense, it can be rhetorically useful to spin the accusation in a more positive direction, even if it's not really the case that Engels is making. On authority, therefore, tends to attract both good faith actors looking to learn about Marxism or critiques of anarchism, as well as bad faith actors who do not particularly care to critically examine what Engels said. I definitely agree with that. In either case, though, it remains a fairly beginner text, apparently not requiring any deep familiarity with the rest of the Marxist corpus. I'd actually go in so far as if you read parts of Capitals Volume 1 and 3, it's in contradiction to parts of the Marxist corpus. Particularly about, for example, the way Marx himself distinguishes the authority of delegated power versus the authority of managerial power and stuff like that. But nonetheless, because it's so easy to read and seems so definitive, people just kind of accept it for that. For those who are familiar, it might be dusted off every once in a while when an anarchist is encountered in the wild, but rarely engaged at anything close to a deep and meaningful level. Absolutely. Agree with that. On the rare occasion this does happen, however, opinions of it tend to be more negative. Not only does it represent the representation of anarchist thought seem extremely questionable, even if it seems out of place within Marxism itself. For example, Robert C. Tucker, the historian and editor of the Marx Engels Reader, translated on authority, wrote in his introduction, and I remember this. This was another thing I remember encountering this on. In the article in October 1872 and originally published in Italian in the collection Assemano Repubblicano, Alamanico Republicano, for in 1874, Engels continued the debate against the anarchists. Of special note is his argument that revolution itself is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is, and it's for the contention, which seems inconsistent of some of what we know of the thinking of Marx, that machine industry is inherently despotic in its relationship to workers. Tucker is right to call out this inconsistency. Yeah, I think he is. Whenever Marx and Engels typically describe industry as despotic, it is presented as a direct consequence of capitalism and alienated labor having turned the worker into a mere appendage of the machine. Socialism, the emancipation of the proletariat, is meant to fix the issue. For Engels to claim that industry is inherently despotic and that the worker will continue to be dominated by it even within socialism sticks out. This tension could easily be missed by someone not familiar with Marxist theory, which tends to be the essay's exact audience. Yeah, Marxists who don't really know Marx. And I hate to say that Marxists often don't know Marx, but often they don't, is seemingly part of what's at play here. To be fair, a lot of people don't know Marx. For those of you who are familiar with scientific theory, On Authority is generally seen as a fairly marginal text containing little insight at best, and certainly not anything close to a definitive rebuke of anarchism, which has had 150 years to formulate a full response. Yeah, I mean, Marx, this is my thing. I think Marxists outside of the Marxist-Leninist tradition arguing on the internet with anarchists don't look at On Authority because it's a weak text. Anarchists look at it because it's the one that supposedly refutes them. Even compared to the anarchist theory of the time, though, it's not clear that it was ever a successful critique. This can be partly seen in Simon Masalin's The Question of Stagnant Marxism. Is Marxism exegetical or scientific? Long quote. On Authority is clearly one of Engels' weakest texts, where the clarity and sharpness of his other texts, like Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, are markedly absent. Absolutely agree. Yet, terminally online Marxists constantly cite it again and again and appeal to its authority as if it were an a priori correct simply because Engels wrote it. Any anarchists worth their black banners can demolish the weak foundations on which Engels built On Authority, and no Marxist who has done the work of engaging with both Marxist and anarchist canons, would cite this weakest of Engels' texts in critiquing anarchism. 100% agree. Renato Flores concurs, writing in Anarchism and the Necessity of a Modern Critique that they recognize the need for critiques of anarchism to be updated over a century later. Quote, on the year of the 100th anniversary of Kronstadt, in a year where anarchists just love to critique Lenin as a bloody counter-revolutionary, we have to recognize that the up-to-date and thorough piece on the failures of anarchism has still to be written. The two texts we usually cite to counteract anarchist tendencies on authority and state and revolution, but I think they are ultimately unconvincing, especially compared to something like The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which points much better at anarchism's weaknesses. I tend to critique on authority on both fronts, showing how it not only fails to properly engage with anarchist theory, but becomes problematic for Marxists who endorse it. To do this properly, we need a fair amount of Marxist and anarchist theory in the process. Preferably, this should be done using anarchist works written prior to On Authority was written to see if Engels' argument was appropriate at the time. Given how early this was written in the development of anarchist thought, even before the name anarchist had stuck, this can be difficult, especially considering that many of the texts have not been translated. It is still useful to compare the essay to later anarchist writings, though, given that the essay is used against even present-day anarchists. To help work around this issue, I tend to analyze early anarchist works I can and hope that I can establish enough points of connection with later anarchist writings to show the level of consistency, especially as these ideas become more refined and jargon is more standardized. I tend to focus on relatively early anarchist works, though, larger from the 19th and early 20th century. I hope that by citing different works of anarchist theory, readers who might otherwise be unfamiliar with anarchism can learn more about it in the process and have exposure to several interesting texts where they can discover more. A brief for refutation of On Authority have been published plenty of times in the 150 years since its publication, exposing its central issues. Readers looking back might look at a source like section H4 of the Anarchist FAQ. Yeah, I would say that that's where I probably first encountered the anarchist critique of it, and I actually thought the anarchists weren't bad. Piper Tompkins on Authority Revisited, other London anarchist federations, the problems with On Authority. My hope is to go beyond these by not only debunking Engels' essay, but also provide a better grasp of what anarchism and Marxism in the process. If these refutations have killed it, I am aiming for overkill. An analysis of On Authority. Before we can properly critique Engels' argument, we need to establish what the argument is. Despite its short length, On Authority has been interpreted in wildly different ways. Asterisk. Yeah, because it's a weak polemical text that has many vague assertions and equivocations in it, and also has some just flat out wrong claims about the development of centralization and what that means. And because of that, a lot of people interpret it in different ways to revalidate it because the plain language reading is so problematic. And that's, you see this in a lot of text. It's not unique to Marxist and On Authority here. Anyway, this is partly due to the inherent vagueness of some of the areas of the essay, and partly due to the attempts at reconciling it with the rest of Marxism. There are also confusions that just inevitably arise when a text becomes overused in online debates. It is something of a meme among online Marxists to spam read On Authority at anarchists. Just like read settlers or read capital have become memes. And gross to all of that, actually. Not that you shouldn't read J. Sakai Settlers or read Capital Volume 1 through 3, or, you get my drift. Anyway. Back to the text. To both demonstrate my familiarity and good faith reading of the text, as well as to correct any mistaken interpretations, I will present a line-by-line analysis of On Authority. Through this process, I hope to clarify certain parts that are frequently misunderstood, while also calling to attention to other portions that I intend to more fully critique later on. I also hope that, should anyone find the general issues with my interpretation of Engels, I will at least have been able to show my work. Perhaps with some greater knowledge of the total works of Marx and Engels could provide better explanations for these ambiguities, and I am able, that's why Barnes here, and to welcome challenges on these points. For the time being, I will instead respond to the interpretations of Engels that I have been able to discover and explain why my reading should be seen as more plausible. The association should also be understood within its historical context, especially its relationship to the International Workingmen's Association, better known as the First International. The International Workingmen's Association was a massive pluralist organization made up of various workers and socialist movements in the 19th century. Marx and Engels held rather powerful positions within the IWA's General Council, but came into conflict with another member, the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who they believed was conspiring to take over the IWA, given his especially strong influence in Switzerland, Spain, and Italy. This conflict culminated in the Hague Congress of 1872, where, through questionable methods, Marx and Engels manufactured a vote to expel Bakunin from the International. For a more detailed history, and anyone, I would refer any interested readers to Wolfgang Eckhardt's The First Socialist Schism, Bakunin versus Marx and the International Workingmen's Association, 2016. I would also say that book is excellent. It has been an especially helpful work for finding many primary sources. For a somewhat briefer presentation of this history, I'd recommend Robert Graham's Do Not Fear Anarchy, We Invoke It, the First International and the Origins of the Anarchist Movement, 2015. The actual publication history on authority appears to be relatively straightforward. An Italian newspaper editor named Enrico Bignami planned on beginning a yearbook called Almanaco Repubblicano, and for this he requested an article from Engels and Marx on July 31st, 1872, and on October 10th, 1872, respectively. Both used the opportunity to write an attack on anarchism, Marx writing his essay Political Indifferentism, while Engels wrote on authority. On November 3rd, 1872, Bignami wrote to Engels that he had received the articles in October. However, due to the political police persecution, Bignami was arrested and the manuscript was lost. Bignami informed Engels about this on March 1873, requesting another copy or an alternative essay to publish, and Engels then provided. This would become the version known today and was published for the Almanac in 1874 and December of 1873. It would be printed for the first time in English in the New Review, number 4, in New York, 1914. Before proceeding, I, of course, encourage any reader to read on authority itself. And you can refer to my essay where we did just that, and you can hear my critiques of authority, or to even reread it so the argument will be fresh in their minds. And because I intend to reference later parts of this essay as I go through my analysis, it can be read here, and he gives the link. I'm going to stop here. We're going to come back. I think this is a pretty fair assertion of the context and why we're talking about this, and why I think this text is so problematic even for Marxists to adopt as a critique of anarchism. There might be better critiques of anarchism to be made, but this is not one of them. This one actually hurts many Marxist promises too and makes us seem like bad faith actors. On that note, we're going to end this one. This is going to be a long series, so I'm going to break it down into chunks. Have a great day. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. Share and share alike.